The Christmas candles were glowing, the house was full of laughter, and wrapping paper was scattered across the floor like confetti. Everyone around that table was holding something beautiful. Everyone except me. I sat in the corner of my own daughter's living room with empty hands while she handed out gifts to neighbors, to in-laws, to people she had known for 5 years. Then she turned and looked at me, and she laughed, not a soft laugh, not an embarrassed laugh. A loud, sharp, deliberate laugh. "Oh, we forgot about you, Dad," the room chuckled with her. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, and said the word that cut deeper than any silence ever could, contributing. That was the moment I understood. This was not a mistake. This was a message. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted everyone in that room to see the old man who no longer mattered. What they did not know, what none of them could have imagined, was that I had been holding something in my pocket the entire evening. Something that would change everything before that night was over. I smiled, gently reached into my coat and said, "It's okay. Look what I got." And the room went completely silent. Stay with me, because what happens next is the kind of story that will keep you on the edge of your seat from beginning to end. There is betrayal in this story. There is humiliation. There is a secret built-in love by someone who saw everything coming long before I did. And there is a moment of justice so complete, so perfectly earned, that you will not believe it until you hear it yourself. My name is Walter Holt. I am 72 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades designing bridges and overpasses across the mid-Atlantic states, structures built to hold weight, to endure, to connect people across distances they could not cross alone. I thought I understood load-bearing. I thought I understood stress. I had no idea, standing on my daughter's front porch that December evening with a bag of carefully wrapped gifts in my hand, that the most important test of my life was about to begin. The cold that night had real teeth to it. My breath came out in small clouds as I stood beneath the porch light, listening to the muffled laughter inside the house before I even rang the bell. Through the frosted window, I could see the glow of the Christmas tree, the movement of people carrying plates and glasses, the easy comfort of a gathering that had been going on for a while without me. I had driven 40 minutes to be here. I had spent 3 weeks choosing the gifts in that bag. I told myself the way I always told myself, that this year would feel different. That grief softens with time, that distance closes if you keep showing up. Eleanor had been gone for 2 years, and I was still learning how to enter rooms without her. I pressed the doorbell and waited. Diane opened the door after a long moment, and the smile she gave me was the kind that lives only on the surface of a face. She leaned in for a hug that lasted no longer than it takes to blink twice, her body held away from mine just enough to make the gesture feel like a formality. No warmth, no real welcome, just the performance of a daughter who had somewhere else she would rather be. She was wearing a cashmere sweater and the perfume Eleanor used to wear. And for a half second that scent nearly undid me completely. Inside the house looked like something assembled for a magazine photograph. Garlands on every surface, ornaments that caught the light like small precious stones. A tree so symmetrical it hardly seemed real. The living room was full of people. Craig, Diane's husband, holding court near the fireplace. Their daughter, Harper, 17, and quiet in the way teenagers get quiet when they are paying attention to everything. Ryan's sister and her husband, 2 neighbors I had met once before and whose names I could not recall. Everyone seemed to belong to the room in a way I did not. I set my bag of gifts near the tree and said hello to the people who looked up. I had chosen those gifts carefully. A vintage pocket watch for Craig from an estate sale, the kind he had admired once years ago when we still had conversations that went somewhere. A silver bracelet for Diane that reminded me of one Eleanor had worn on special occasions, delicate and understated. For Harper, a boxed set of 3 novels by an author I knew she loved, because she was the kind of girl who still read real books, and I respected that about her enormously. They were not expensive gifts, but they were chosen with actual thought, which I believed counted for something. The gift exchange that followed was theatrical in a way I had not quite expected. Craig tore open a large box to find a top-of-the-line golf set, the clubs gleaming under the chandelier light, and he let out a whoop that rattled the ornaments. Harper received a brand new laptop and covered her mouth with both hands. Diane unwrapped diamond earrings and held them up to the light while everyone made appreciative sounds. Even the neighbors received generous gift cards tucked inside bottles of premium wine, and they thanked Diane and Craig with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that filled the room like warmth. I sat on the end of the couch and watched all of it, glad for the happiness around me, waiting my turn with the patience I had spent a lifetime practicing. The pile disappeared. The room settled into the soft noise of people examining their things, comparing, admiring. And then Diane looked around with an expression of slow, theatrical discovery, her eyes eventually finding me in my corner with my 2 empty hands, and she pressed her fingers to her lips as though something had just occurred to her that genuinely surprised her. I will not describe what came next in detail. You already know what she said, and you already know how the room responded. What I want you to understand is what happened as I was putting on my coat to leave after dinner after every indignity that followed. Because as I reached for the door, a hand closed around my sleeve with a grip that was desperate and deliberate and completely unlike anything I expected from a 17-year-old girl. Harper pulled me close, checked over her shoulder to make certain no one was watching, and put her lips near my ear. "Grandpa," she whispered, and her voice was shaking. "Don't sign anything, please." I heard them planning something. I did not sleep that night. I drove the 40 minutes home in the kind of silence that has weight to it, Harper's whisper playing on a loop somewhere behind my eyes. And when I finally pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat in the dark for a long time without moving. Inside the house was the way it always was. Now quiet in every room, Eleanor's reading chair still angled toward the lamp, the way she had positioned it years ago. Her handwriting still on the grocery list, magneted to the refrigerator, because I had never been able to throw it away. I made coffee I did not drink and sat at the kitchen table as the darkness outside the window slowly gave way to gray, then pale blue, then the thin, flat light of a December morning. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself Harper was 17 rather, a teenager, who had overheard a partial conversation and filled in the rest with imagination. I told myself that Diane was difficult and cold and that the evening had been humiliating, but that humiliation was not the same thing as conspiracy. I told myself all of this very carefully, and I did not believe a single word of it. My phone rang at 7:30. Harper's name appeared on the screen, and when I answered, her voice came through in a whisper so compressed it was barely sound at all. She told me she was standing in the bathroom at school, that she had maybe 5 minutes before her first class, and that she needed to tell me everything she had been carrying around for the past several weeks. I gripped the phone with both hands and told her to go ahead. She had come downstairs for a glass of water on a night about a month earlier, sometime past midnight, and seen the light under the door of Diane's home office. She had stopped in the hallway the way you stop when something feels wrong before you can name the reason. Through the door, she heard Diane's voice, low and clipped and purposeful. "We need to move quickly before he gets suspicious." She heard the words, "assisted living facility." She heard Craig's voice, tighter and more anxious than Diane's, saying something about debts catching up and running out of time before February. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough to go back upstairs without making a sound and lie awake until morning. Then, just a few nights before Christmas, she woke up past 2 in the morning and saw the light again. This time she crept far enough down the hallway to see through the gap in the office door. Diane was at her desk printing something. When Diane crossed the room to collect the pages from the printer, Harper saw the title printed at the top of the first sheet in large official lettering: Property Deed Transfer. She ran back to her room and did not sleep again that night. She told me all of this in a voice that was steady in the way that very frightened people sometimes get steady. And when she was done, she said, "Grandpa, whatever she asks you to sign, please don't. Not until someone you trust has looked at it." I told her she had done the right thing by telling me. I told her I loved her and that she should go to class and try to have a normal day. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap for a very long time. My daughter was planning to take my house. My daughter had been sitting across from me at dinner tables and asking about my health and hugging me for exactly 1 second per embrace. And the entire time she had been counting square footage and calculating market value and deciding which month would be most convenient to move me somewhere I had not chosen, so that she and Craig could manage the proceeds of a life Eleanor and I had built together over 40 years. A memory came back to me then, one I had not thought about in a long time. Eleanor in her hospital bed during those final weeks, the morphine making her drift sometimes, but her mind still sharp underneath it when she wanted it to be. She had taken my hand one afternoon and looked at me with an expression I had not known how to read at the time. "If things ever feel wrong after I'm gone," she had said, "if you ever feel like something is happening that shouldn't be, find Vivian. She knows what to do." I had kissed her hand and told her not to worry, told her I would be fine, told myself she was tired and medicated and frightened of leaving me alone. Eleanor had never once, in 41 years of marriage, said anything she did not mean. I had filed that moment away as something to protect her from rather than something to remember. I was still sitting at the table, still holding the phone, when I heard a car door close in my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Diane checking her reflection in the rearview mirror, before stepping out, pressing a smile into place like someone pinning a corsage. She was carrying a leather portfolio of the kind I associated with closing arguments and loan signings. She had not called ahead. She had simply appeared the morning after Christmas, with her portfolio and her borrowed smile, and what I already knew was a very specific purpose for being there. I got up, straightened my sweater, and went to open the door. When she kissed my cheek, I smelled Eleanor's perfume again, and I kept my face completely open and completely calm, and I let her in. She spread the documents across my kitchen table 40 minutes later, explaining each one in a voice calibrated to sound like patience and concern. Property deed transfers, power of attorney forms, something titled Voluntary Competency Assessment that made the back of my neck go cold. She said words like peace of mind and proper care, and we just want what's best for you, Dad. I nodded slowly. I asked her to repeat things. I rubbed my hands together and mentioned my arthritis. I told her the print was small and my eyes were not what they used to be. She did not quite manage to hide her impatience, but she tried, and I gave her credit for trying. By the time she left, I had agreed to nothing and kept everything, and as I watched her car disappear down the street, I picked up the portfolio she had left behind and carried it to the kitchen table and put on my reading glasses. My hands were steady as I opened the first document. They did not stay that way for long. The first document I examined was the power of attorney. I read it twice slowly, the way I had been trained to read engineering specifications, where a misplaced decimal could bring down a structure. The language was dense and the font was small, but I worked through it paragraph by paragraph, and what I found when I reached the execution page stopped me cold. The date on the signature line was 14 months ago. A date I remembered clearly because I had spent that entire week in a surgical center 40 miles away, having my left knee reconstructed flat on my back in a hospital bed for 4 days and then on a walker for 3 weeks after that. I had not signed anything on that date. I had not been capable of signing anything on that date. I sat with that fact for a moment, and then I kept reading. The property deed transfer was next. I went through it line by line, and I found the detail Elliot would later tell me was the most legally damning element in the entire package. Diane was listed on the document as my primary caregiver. That was the precise phrase used, primary caregiver, as though it were simply a statement of established fact. In the 2 years since Eleanor's funeral, my daughter had visited me 11 times. I knew the number because I had written each visit in the small calendar I kept on the kitchen counter, the way Eleanor had always kept a calendar, because Eleanor believed that a life worth living was a life worth recording. 11 visits in 24 months. 2 of those had lasted less than an hour. Primary caregiver. I set the document down and picked up my coffee and found it had gone completely cold. I was shuffling the papers back into order, trying to decide whether to call Elliot's office first or drive directly to Vivian's house, when a single sheet slipped out from behind the main deed transfer and landed face up on the table. I almost set it aside without reading it. I am grateful every day that I did not. It was a second copy of the property deed, printed on the same official stock, formatted identically to the first, but the terms were not identical. Not even close. The version Diane had shown me contained language about using proceeds from the sale of the property to cover my residential care costs at Sunny Pines Senior Living. It was written to sound like provision, like daughterly concern, translated into legal obligation. This second copy, the one that had slipped out by accident, contained no such language. It transferred the property free and clear to Diane and Craig Mercer, with no mention of my care, no mention of my expenses, no obligation of any kind toward the man whose name was on the original deed. There were 2 versions of the same document. One for me to see and feel reassured by. One for the county recorder's office. I put the paper down on the table very carefully, as though it were something that might shatter. I looked out the kitchen window at the bare oak tree in the backyard, the one Eleanor had planted when we first moved into this house, now taller than the roofline. I had built a career understanding how things fail. I had spent 40 years calculating the precise point at which a structure subjected to forces it was not designed to bear would give way. I understood now that I was looking at the blueprints of my own demolition drawn up by my daughter in the months since her mother's death, executed with a patience and a coldness that I still could not entirely accept as real. A memory came to me then with a sharpness that felt almost physical. Eleanor, 3 days before she died, had taken my hand with a grip that was stronger than it had any right to be given what the illness had done to her. She had looked at me with eyes that were entirely clear, entirely present, entirely her. "Thomas," she had said, using the name she only used when something mattered absolutely. "If things ever go wrong after I'm gone, if you ever feel like the ground is shifting under your feet, find Vivian Cross before you do anything else. She knows what to do." I had held her hand and told her I understood, and I had told myself it was the medication speaking, or the fear, or the particular cruelty of dying and knowing the person you loved most would be left alone in the world. Eleanor had never once wasted words. I had wasted that one. I reached for my phone with the intention of calling Vivian, and before I could unlock the screen, it rang in my hand. Diane's name on the display. I answered on the second ring and kept my voice exactly as she expected it, to sound tired, vaguely confused, slightly defeated. She did not bother with pleasantries. Her voice had shed every layer of the concerned daughter performance she had worn all morning, and what remained was flat and businesslike and in a hurry. She needed the documents back. Tomorrow morning. It was urgent. Time-sensitive legal matters. She said the same phrase she had used at the table, as though repetition would make it feel less like a threat. I told her my hands were giving me trouble and I had not finished reading everything. I told her I wanted to understand what I was signing before I signed it. She did not like this answer, but she accepted it. And when we hung up, I sat for one more moment at the table where Eleanor and I had paid 40 years of bills together. Then I put on my coat, picked up the portfolio, and drove to Vivian Cross's house. I had no plan beyond reaching her front door. I did not yet understand that Eleanor had already made one for me. Vivian Cross lived in a brick townhouse on the east side of town. White shutters, window boxes empty in December, a wreath on the door that she changed with every season. I had been to that house more times than I could count. Over the 30 years she and Eleanor had been close, for dinner parties and holidays and quiet Sunday afternoons, when Eleanor simply wanted to sit with her oldest friend and drink tea, and talk about things I was not always privy to. I had thought I knew that house. I had thought I knew the woman inside it. I climbed the front steps with the portfolio under my arm and rang the bell, and Vivian opened the door before the sound had finished echoing, as though she had been standing just inside waiting for exactly this. She took one look at my face and at the leather portfolio and said with a certainty that stopped me where I stood, she finally made her move. Not a question, not a guess. A statement delivered in the tone of someone confirming something they have been expecting for a long time. I stood on her front step in the December cold and asked her how she could possibly have known that, and she stepped back from the door and said, "Come inside, Walter. I'll make tea." There was something in her voice that told me the tea was not really the point. Her living room was the way it always was, books on every surface, afternoon light coming through, lace curtains, 2 chairs angled toward each other near the window, as though a conversation had been paused there and was waiting to be resumed. I spread Diane's documents across her coffee table and I told her everything. The Christmas humiliation, Harper's whispered warning at the front door, the morning phone call from the school bathroom, Diane's arrival with the portfolio and the 2 versions of the same deed. Vivian listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her expression moving through something that was not quite surprise and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her teacup with the careful deliberateness of someone who is choosing their next words with great precision. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. "Something Eleanor made me promise to tell you if this day ever came." She looked at me steadily, and in that moment I noticed something about her face that I could not believe I had never registered in 30 years of knowing her. The shape of her eyes, the particular way she held her chin when she was composing herself. I had seen that expression 10,000 times. I had fallen in love with it in 1974. Vivian and Eleanor were half-sisters. Same mother, different fathers. Their family had fractured when Vivian married James Cross, a man the family considered beneath them, and the fracture had been total and unforgiving, the kind that leaves no room for reconciliation. Everyone had cut Vivian off. Everyone except Eleanor, who had been 19 years old at the time and had looked at the situation and decided with the clarity that would define her entire life. That love was not something you withdrew because the people around you demanded it. They had stayed close for 50 years. They had kept it secret because Eleanor had wanted to see when the time came who would truly stand beside me. If Diane loves her father the way she should, Eleanor had told Vivian she will care for him properly and none of this will matter. And if she doesn't, then we will know and we will be ready. Vivian got up and went to the closet near the hallway and returned with a metal box, the kind with a small combination lock on the front, the kind designed to be fireproof and private. She set it on the table between us and opened it, and inside were file folders, each one labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, the precise and unhurried script I would have recognized anywhere. She lifted out the first folder and handed it to me without a word. The top sheet was a handwritten note dated 18 months before Eleanor died. Diane asked about the house appraisal today. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, factual and without drama. Didn't ask how I was feeling. Didn't ask about the new treatment protocol, just the house. I turned to the next page and found another note written 2 weeks later. Diane called to ask about the life insurance policy. Which company, what the payout structure was. I had not finished the call before she asked. I went through the folder slowly, page by page, each entry a small, precise record of a daughter cataloging her inheritance while her mother was still using it to stay alive. Eleanor had given Diane chances. The notes made that clear too. Mentions of conversations where she had waited to see if concern would follow the asset questions. It never did. Vivian reached into the box again and produced a small digital recorder, the kind you can hold in one hand. She pressed play and set it on the table between us. The voice that came out of it hit me the way a wave hits when you are not braced for it. Diane, somewhere in the middle of a visit, her tone bright and practical and entirely unbothered. "Mom, have you talked to a financial planner yet about restructuring the assets before anything happens?" And then, Eleanor's voice, calm and measured, and containing something underneath the calm that I understood now, was the sound of a woman making a decision. "I'll look into it," Eleanor said. And that was all. But I heard what was in those 4 words because I had spent 41 years learning how Eleanor sounded when something had just broken inside her and she had chosen not to show it. Vivian turned off the recorder. She told me that Eleanor had contacted an attorney named Elliot Marsh 3 years ago, shortly after the diagnosis, and that Elliot had built something under Eleanor's precise and patient direction. A trust, legal protections, a structure designed to stand up to exactly what Diane was now attempting. "You need to be in his office tomorrow morning," Vivian said. She looked at me across the coffee table with Eleanor's eyes and a face I was only now truly seeing for the first time. "There is one more thing," she said, setting her cup down. "Eleanor didn't just document what Diane was doing. She built something. Something Diane never knew existed. And Walter, once you see what your wife built for you, you will understand that she never stopped fighting for you. Not even in her final days." Elliot Marsh kept his office on the 3rd floor of a building downtown that had been standing since 1931, all dark wood paneling and frosted glass, and the particular smell of old paper and serious work. I arrived at 9 the next morning, having slept perhaps 3 hours, and his assistant showed me in without making me wait. Elliot himself was already at his desk. A compact man in his mid-60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years sitting across from people in crisis and had learned that calm was the most useful thing he could offer them. He stood and shook my hand, firmly gestured to the chair across from him, and set a thick manila folder on the desk between us before he said a single word about its contents. "Eleanor's file," he said. He told me she had called his office 3 years ago, 2 weeks after receiving her diagnosis. She had come in alone without telling me, and she had arrived with a legal pad covered in handwritten notes, organized under headings because that was the way Eleanor approached every problem she had ever decided to solve. He said she was the most methodical client he had worked with in 3 decades of practice, and he said it with a respect that was not the kind you perform for a grieving widower, but the kind that comes from genuine experience of a person's mind. He opened the folder and began to walk me through what she had built. The foundation of it was a revocable living trust, established in Eleanor's name and transferred to my sole benefit upon her death. She had moved into it the majority of our shared financial life, the investment accounts we had built over 40 years, the proceeds from the sale of our previous home when we downsized a decade ago, the savings we had accumulated through 4 decades of careful living. The total value of the trust at the time of our meeting was approximately $2.4 million. Elliot let that number settle in the room for a moment before continuing. Diane Mercer, he said, appearing nowhere in the trust documents. Not as a beneficiary, not as a contingent beneficiary, not as a trustee or co-administrator. She had no claim on any portion of it, no legal standing to contest its terms, and no knowledge that it existed. Eleanor had kept it entirely separate from everything Diane might have thought to look for. I sat with that for a moment. $2.4 million built quietly over a lifetime, protected quietly in the final months of another person's life, held in trust for me by a man I was meeting for the first time. I thought about all the questions Diane had asked during those hospital visits, all the asset questions Eleanor had recorded in her notes, and I understood that Diane had been looking at the surface of our finances and calculating from what she could see. She had never imagined there was a floor beneath the floor. The house, Elliot explained, was the one asset Eleanor had not been able to transfer without my signature, which was why it remained outside the trust and why Diane had identified it as her most accessible target. But Eleanor had anticipated this too. He reached into the folder and produced a separate document thicker than the rest, bearing the seal of a notary public and the signatures of 2 witnesses. It was a deed transferring ownership of my house to Harper Mercer, effective upon her 18th birthday or earlier, if circumstances required the transfer to protect my welfare. Eleanor had prepared it 2 years ago, weeks before she died, in a session Elliot described as one of the most focused and deliberate he had ever conducted with a client who was also saying goodbye. The deed had been sitting in his safe ever since, waiting for the moment it became necessary. Harper did not know it existed. I had not known it existed. But Eleanor had known. With the precision she brought to everything that mattered, exactly what would be needed and exactly where to put it. Elliot then examined Diane's documents, the ones from the portfolio, spreading them across his desk and going through each page with a patience that I recognized as methodical rather than slow. When he reached the power of attorney, he set it aside and wrote something on his legal pad. When he reached the 2 versions of the deed transfer, he placed them side by side and was quiet for a moment. Then he told me clearly and without softening it that what I was looking at constituted felony fraud. The backdated signature on the power of attorney, executed on a date my surgical records would directly contradict. The 2 versions of the same deed, one designed to deceive me and one designed to deceive the county recorder's office. He said the word felony the way engineers say structural failure, as a precise technical description of a condition with serious consequences. His advice was to do nothing that would alert Diane to what I now knew. No confrontation, no withdrawal, no sudden change in behavior. We needed her to continue to take one more step that would capture her intent beyond any legal doubt. He mentioned a man named Rex Caulfield, an investigator he had worked with for years, quiet and thorough and entirely trustworthy. He said the word patience in a way that suggested it was not a passive condition but an active one, a thing you had to decide on and then maintain against the pressure of everything you were feeling. I drove home that afternoon along the same roads I had traveled for 20 years, past the same intersections and the same landmarks, and the world looked precisely as it always had and felt entirely different. I was not a frightened old man sitting alone in a house that was about to be taken from him. I was an engineer looking at a compromised structure, identifying the load-bearing points, calculating exactly what it would take to make the whole thing hold. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat as I turned into my street. Harper. I picked it up at the next light and read the message, and the last piece of what I needed settled quietly into place. Mom has a meeting with a real estate agent Thursday afternoon, she had written. I know exactly where it is. And Grandpa, I think I can get inside. I called Harper back from my driveway, still sitting in the car with the engine off and the cold beginning to work its way through my coat. My first instinct was to tell her no. She was 17 years old, and she had already done more than any 17-year-old should have to do for a grandparent, and the thought of her walking into a real estate office to record her own mother discussing the sale of my house sat in my chest like something I did not know how to carry. I told her I appreciated it. I told her she had already been braver than I had any right to ask, and I told her I needed her to let the adults handle what came next. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to tell me I had said the wrong thing. Then she said quietly and without any particular heat in it that she was not asking for my permission, she was telling me what she intended to do and that she would feel better if I knew about it beforehand rather than after. I did not have an answer for that. I called Vivian that evening and described the conversation, and Vivian listened the way she always listened, which was completely and without interruption, and when I finished, she said something I have thought about many times since. Don't take away her agency, Walter. She is more like Eleanor than you know. I sat with that for a moment, and then I told Vivian she was probably right, and Vivian said she was definitely right, and that was the end of the discussion. I called Harper back and told her to be careful and to trust her instincts, and that whatever she captured would be useful. She said she already knew that. She sounded exactly like her grandmother. Rex Caulfield came to my house on Wednesday evening, introduced by a brief text from Elliot that described him only as reliable and discreet, which turned out to be an accurate summary of the man himself. He was in his early 50s, unremarkable in appearance in a way that seemed deliberate, the kind of person you would not remember having seen in a room an hour after leaving it. He sat at my kitchen table and walked me through the technical details of recording a conversation legally in this state which required only one party's consent, meaning my own, and he showed me how to position my phone to capture clear audio without drawing attention to it. He also told me something I had not considered, which was that my manner during any recorded conversation was as important as the words spoken around me. The more uncertain and compliant I appeared, he said, the more freely the other person would speak. Cooperate with your own exploitation, he said, and they will hand you everything you need. I practiced. I am not embarrassed to admit it. I sat in the kitchen after Rex left and rehearsed the voice I would use with Diane, the slightly slower cadence, the repetition of her last phrase as though I was still catching up to it, the occasional pause to rub my hands together and mention my joints. Eleanor had said once a long time ago at a party where I had been telling a story I had told too many times that I was a better actor than I gave myself credit for. I had laughed it off. It did not seem funny, now it seemed useful, and I worked at it until it felt natural. The report Rex left on my table before he went was 4 pages single-spaced, and it answered several questions I had not known how to ask. Craig Mercer carried approximately $175,000 in personal debt, accumulated through a combination of private gambling losses and 2 failed investments in technology ventures that had dissolved, without returning a dollar. There were 3 active judgment liens against him filed at the county courthouse, which were public record and which Rex had simply looked up. One creditor had contacted Craig's employer. A bankruptcy attorney had received 3 calls from Craig's cell phone in the past 6 weeks, each one longer than the last. The picture that assembled itself from these details was not of a man who had made some bad decisions and was working his way through them. It was of a man who was running out of road and knew it. Whatever Diane had told herself about the reasons for what they were planning, Craig's reasons were stark and numerical and arriving by mail. I called Diane Thursday morning. I kept my voice at the register I had been practicing, tired and slightly overwhelmed and ready, I implied, to stop resisting. I told her I had been thinking about what she had said about the house being too much for one person, about the value of having people around. I said I thought maybe she had a point. I said I was not sure about everything in those documents, but I was willing to talk through it. I said I just wanted peace with my family. The relief in her voice was so immediate and so unguarded that it told me everything I needed to know about how confident she had been in her own reading of me. She suggested Saturday evening. She said she and Craig would bring the paperwork and we could settle everything over dinner at my house. I said that sounded just fine. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, and then I called Elliot and told him Saturday was confirmed, and he said he would begin the necessary arrangements. That evening, Harper sent me a text message that I read 3 times before setting my phone face down on the table. She had seen Diane at her desk after dinner, she wrote, reviewing the documents with a pen in her hand. She had watched from the hallway. The clause about using the house proceeds to cover my care costs at Sunny Pines had been crossed out. Not revised, not replaced with alternative language. Simply crossed out in Diane's handwriting on the copy she apparently believed I would never see again. Harper had told me she knew how to get inside the real estate office, and when she explained her plan, I understood why she had been so certain. Diane had a habit long established of bringing Harper along on errands when Craig was unavailable, and she did not want to appear in public as a woman who went everywhere alone. It was not warmth that motivated this. Harper had explained to me once with the clear-eyed perception of someone who had spent 17 years studying her mother at close range. It was image. A woman shopping or meeting with professionals while her teenage daughter waited nearby looked like a person with a normal life. So when Diane mentioned Thursday afternoon's appointment in passing at breakfast and said Harper should come along and bring something to do, Harper had simply said, "Sure, Mom," and gone upstairs to put her phone in the front pocket of her hoodie and plug one earbud into her left ear, the right one left empty, so that she could hear everything around her while appearing to listen to music. I did not know any of this while it was happening. I spent Thursday afternoon in my kitchen doing what Rex had suggested I do in the days before Saturday, which was to behave exactly as I normally would and make no changes to my routine that might register as unusual to anyone watching. I drank coffee. I read the newspaper. I called an old colleague from my working years and talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential. I was very calm on the outside and something else entirely underneath it. And around 3 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Harper that said, "Only inside now," and then went silent. She called me that evening from her bedroom with the door locked and her voice low and controlled in a way that reminded me so precisely of Eleanor that for a moment I could not speak. She described the office, described where she had positioned herself in a chair near the window, with her phone angled toward the center of the room, described the moment Nadine Fowler had come out to greet Diane, and they had moved together into the inner office. Harper had followed at a natural distance and taken a seat in the waiting area just outside the open door, close enough for the phone to capture everything clearly. She had sat there for 40 minutes with her earbud and scrolling through her phone while her mother discussed the sale of my home 12 feet away. Diane had presented herself to Nadine Fowler as a woman managing a difficult family situation with practical efficiency. She spoke about my age and my limitations, about the house being too large for one person to maintain, about the family having reached a consensus that a transition to managed care was the responsible choice. She used the word transition 4 times. She never once used the word father. She asked about current market conditions in my zip code, about average days on market, about whether a property of my home's square footage and lot size would attract buyers quickly. Nadine gave her numbers, professional and thorough, and Diane listened and asked follow-up questions with the focused attention of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time. At one point, Diane mentioned in a tone designed to sound like an incidental detail that once the transfer paperwork cleared, she would want to move quickly on the listing, ideally before the end of January, because the spring market in our area tended to reward early inventory. She said the words transfer paperwork with the ease of someone describing something already accomplished. Then Nadine had asked the question that cracked Diane's composure just slightly, just enough to hear it if you were listening for it. State law, Nadine explained, required her to meet personally with the property owner before accepting any listing agreement. Her brokerage had a strict compliance policy on this point, and she took it seriously. When could she schedule a meeting with Walter Holt directly? The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Diane said she would need to check my schedule, that I had a great many medical appointments these days, that she would be in touch. Her voice had not changed its register, but the easy momentum of the conversation had stopped, and what replaced it was the sound of a woman recalculating. Elliot listened to the recording that evening over the phone, and he was quiet for a long time after it ended. Then he said it was exactly what we needed, and that he would contact the district attorney's office first thing in the morning. I thanked Harper again before we hung up, and she said in the tone of someone with more on her mind than she was, saying that there was one more thing she wanted to do. I started to respond, and she stopped me. "Grandpa," she said, "trust me. I've been thinking about this for 2 days, and I know it's right." I told her I trusted her completely, which was true, and we said goodnight. What she did not tell me, and what I only learned afterward, was that she waited until past midnight, until the house had been silent long enough that she was certain, and then she carried her phone downstairs in the dark and sat on the room floor with her back against the couch and dialed the Adult Protective Services county line. Her voice, when the intake worker answered, was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. She identified herself, explained the situation, described the forged documents, and offered to send the audio files. The intake worker asked her several questions, took down every detail, and when Harper mentioned the recordings, the response was immediate. An officer would conduct a wellness check within 48 hours. Harper was told she was very brave for calling. She crept back upstairs and lay in the dark, her heart loud in her ears, and did not sleep for a long time, because she had just set something in motion that none of us would be able to stop. 2 days passed in the particular kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. I went about my routines with the deliberate steadiness Rex had advised, making coffee in the morning, walking the neighborhood in the afternoon, keeping my phone nearby without staring at it. Elliot called once to confirm that the materials Harper had sent were in the hands of the appropriate people and that the process was moving. He told me to expect a contact within 48 hours and to behave. When it came exactly as I had been behaving all week, like a man who was uncertain about his situation and grateful for any guidance offered to him. I told him I understood. I had been practicing that particular performance long enough by now that it no longer felt like a performance at all. On Sunday afternoon, Diane called and invited me to dinner. The invitation was warm and specific in its warmth, the kind of warmth that is applied carefully rather than felt naturally, and she mentioned that she had made pot roast, which she knew I loved, and that it would be good for the family to spend time together before everything got sorted out. The phrase "everything got sorted out" did considerable work in that sentence. I accepted with the grateful, slightly relieved tone of an old man who had been difficult and knew it and was ready now to cooperate. I drove to her house that evening and rang the doorbell, and Craig answered in a good sweater, with a glass of wine already in his hand and a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. We sat down to eat at 6:30. The pot roast was good. The conversation was the careful kind, all surface and no depth, everyone performing the version of themselves they most wanted the others to accept. I asked Craig about work and he answered briefly and changed the subject. Harper was quiet in the way she had been quiet since Christmas, attentive and watchful, her food moving around her plate more than into her mouth. Diane talked about the neighborhood and an article she had read and the weather expected later in the week, and I listened and nodded and said the things a man says when he has decided to stop fighting and is making his peace with what comes next. I was very convincing. I had reason to be. The doorbell rang at 7:15. Diane set down her fork and looked at Craig with a small frown of genuine puzzlement. Craig shrugged and Diane pushed back her chair and went to answer it, and I watched her cross the room with the easy authority of a woman in her own home on a Sunday evening, expecting nothing more disruptive than a neighbor or a delivery. Left on the wrong porch. The sound that came from the front entry when she opened the door was not what any of us expected. Voices. More than one. Professional and register, measured in tone, carrying the specific weight of official purpose. Diane came back into the dining room doorway, and the change in her face was so complete and so sudden that it looked almost like a physical injury. Standing behind her were 2 uniformed police officers and a woman in a blazer and dark slacks carrying a county identification badge on a lanyard. The woman spoke first, her voice neither warm nor unkind but entirely clear. "Mrs. Mercer, my name is Sandra Reeves from Adult Protective Services. We've received a report of potential financial exploitation involving a member of your household, and we're here to conduct a welfare check on Walter Holt. May we come in?" Craig stood up so fast his chair scraped back across the hardwood. His face had gone the particular shade of red that in my experience indicates a man whose body has understood something before his mind has caught up to it. "This is outrageous," he said. "Whoever called you has no idea what they're talking about." Diane said nothing. She was gripping the doorframe and looking at the 3 people in front of her with an expression I can only describe as a person watching a wall they believed was solid reveal itself as paper. The officers asked to speak with me privately, and I went with them without objection, leaving Craig standing by the table and Diane still in the doorway to Diane's home office at the end of the hall. Sandra Reeves sat across from me and asked me about my living situation in a tone that was gentle without being condescending. I told her I lived alone in my own home. I told her I managed my finances and paid my bills and took care of my property. I told her my wife had passed 2 years ago and that since then my daughter had become very insistent about certain decisions regarding my home and my future. I told her Diane had brought documents for me to sign property transfers and power of attorney forms, and that she had been pressing me to sign them quickly without adequate time to review them. I looked directly at Sandra Reeves when I said the last part. I think my daughter is in a very difficult financial situation. I'm worried about what she might do if she gets desperate enough. Sandra wrote things down and nodded and asked careful follow-up questions, and I answered each one with the precision of a man who has spent 40 years understanding that the details are where the truth lives. When they brought me back to the dining room, Diane and Craig were seated, and Rigid Harper nowhere visible. One of the officers addressed Diane directly, his voice carrying no particular judgment and no particular sympathy, only fact. Based on our conversation with your father and evidence provided to our office, we will be opening a formal investigation into potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The district attorney's office may be in contact. I suggest you consult with an attorney. Craig exploded at that, his voice cracking on the word insane, his hands moving in the air in front of him. The officer waited until Craig finished and then repeated calmly and without revision that they suggested consulting an attorney. I collected my coat and thanked Diane for dinner in the voice of a confused old man who was not entirely sure what had just happened, and I walked to my car and drove away. My phone buzzed before I had reached the end of the block. "Harper, they're fighting. Really bad." Then silence for nearly an hour, and then a second message. I recorded it. "You need to hear this." The audio file came through 30 seconds later, and when I pressed play in the silence of my driveway and Craig's voice filled, the car panicked and stripped of every layer of the composed son-in-law I had watched perform for years. I understood that the ground under Diane and Craig had shifted in ways they were only beginning to feel. "I could go to jail," Craig was saying, his voice tight and high and very afraid. "Do you understand me? If they find those documents, I could go to jail." And then Diane's voice, colder and more controlled than his, saying the words that told me everything I needed to know about what would have to happen before Saturday. "Then we need to move faster," she said. "Before he gets a lawyer, before any of this gets any worse." I listened to the recording 3 times, sitting in my driveway with the engine off and the windows fogging slowly in the cold. The 3rd time I listened, I was not listening for information anymore. I had absorbed all the information there was. I was listening the way you listen to something you want to remember precisely and permanently, every inflection and hesitation stored in a place where it would not blur or soften with time. Craig's voice, stripped of the good sweater and the wine glass, and the performance of a man in comfortable control of his life. Diane's voice beneath his panic, colder and more purposeful than anything I had heard from her in years, possibly ever. "Then we need to move faster." She had said it the way you say something you have already thought through, a conclusion arrived at before the sentence began. I turned off the audio and sat in the dark and thought about my daughter for a long time. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name. It is not the grief of losing someone to death, which is absolute and final and in its own way honest. It is the grief of understanding that someone you have loved completely and without reservation has been for a period of time you cannot precisely calculate someone other than who you believe them to be. I had raised Diane. I had walked the floor with her at 2 a.m. when she was an infant and could not be comforted. I had taught her to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of a Methodist church on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1985, running alongside her with my hand on the back of the seat until the moment I realized I had let go 3 seconds earlier and she had not fallen. I had that memory as clearly as I had anything. And I sat in my driveway that Sunday night and understood that the person in that recording and the child in that parking lot were the same person, and that I was going to have to hold both of those truths at the same time for the rest of my life. I allowed myself that much. Then I went inside and went to bed. I did not call Diane in the morning. I waited. I made coffee and read for an hour and watched the birds at the feeder Eleanor had hung outside the kitchen window 8 years ago. And I let Diane spend the morning in whatever version of Sunday she was experiencing after the previous. night which I suspected was not peaceful. At 10:30 I picked up my phone and dialed her number, and when she answered I made my voice sound exactly as she needed it to sound. Tired. Resigned. An old man who had been through something unsettling and had decided the path of least resistance was the only path worth taking. I told her I did not want police involvement. I told her I did not want lawyers and investigations and whatever came next from a process none of us had asked for. I said I was too old for fighting and too tired for suspicion, and that what I wanted, the only thing I wanted, was peace with my family before I ran out of time to have it. I said I would like to have everyone to my house for dinner on Saturday evening. I said I would sign what she needed. I said I just wanted this to be over. The relief in her voice arrived so quickly that it told me she had been waiting for exactly this call. The tension she had been carrying since Sunday evening came out of her in one long exhaled sentence about how glad she was that I was being reasonable, how much she and Craig had been worried about me, how everything was going to be so much simpler once we had the paperwork settled. I heard Craig in the background, his voice lower and less certain, asking something I could not quite make out. Diane covered the phone briefly and then came back and said Saturday at 6 sounded perfect, and that they would bring everything that needed to be signed and we could have a proper family dinner and put all of this behind us. I thanked her and said I was looking forward to it and told her to drive safely in the cold weather. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment, and then I called Elliot, and then I called Vivian, and I told them both that Saturday was confirmed and that we had 3 days. Elliot came by that afternoon, and we sat in the living room away from the windows and spoke quietly about what the evening would need to accomplish and what it would cost. He was direct with me in the way I had come to appreciate about him, which was to say, he did not soften things that did not benefit from softening. He told me that on Saturday, Diane and Craig would commit fraud in front of witnesses and recording equipment, and that we would have everything required to ensure serious legal consequences. But then he paused and looked at me in the way of a man who has delivered difficult news many times and understands that the legal dimension is rarely the hardest one. He said that beyond the evidence and the documentation and the case that would follow, I would have the chance to tell them the truth, that they had lost everything they had been trying to take, that Eleanor had seen through them years before they knew they were being watched, that their own choices had cost them more than they could calculate. He asked me if I was ready for that. I told him I thought I was. He looked at me steadily for a moment and then nodded, and I understood from the way he nodded that he believed me, and also that he knew it would be harder than I was imagining. Friday morning brought one final message from Harper, a series of photographs taken through the gap in Diane's office door. New documents more aggressive than anything in the original portfolio. A form asserting that I suffered from moderate cognitive decline, though no physician had ever made that finding or anything close to it. Transfer paperwork covering not only the house but my primary checking account and the car in my driveway. A signed admission agreement with Sunny Pines Senior Living, dated for the 1st of February. Diane listed as financial guarantor with authorized access to my assets for the purpose of paying monthly fees. And then a screenshot of Craig's phone screen, visible apparently from across the kitchen while he sat at the counter. A text chain with a number Harper had looked up and identified as belonging to a collections agency, the most recent. Message from Craig sent the previous evening, 3 sentences long and ending with the word please. Harper's accompanying message was 4 words. "They're drowning," she wrote. "They think you're their life raft." I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor's photograph on the refrigerator, the small one in the magnetic frame that I had put there 2 years ago because I needed to see her face in the morning, and I thought about everything she had built in the dark so that I would not have to face this alone. Tomorrow evening it would all come to light. Every document, every recording, every quiet, careful act of love that she had performed in the months before she died, so that the man she was leaving behind would have what he needed when the time came. The time had come. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in weeks. Rex Caulfield arrived Thursday evening with 2 duffel bags and the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work enough times that it no longer required commentary. I let him in and stood back and watched him move through my dining room with a small flashlight and a level examining the light fixtures and the corners of the built-in bookshelves and the angle of the window frames with the focused attention of someone solving a spatial problem. He worked without asking many questions. When he did speak, it was in brief declarative sentences, the way engineers talk when they are concentrating, and I found it comfortable. He mounted 2 cameras in the dining room, one concealed in the base of the table lamp near the sideboard, and one positioned inside the upper housing of the overhead fixture, each angled to capture a different quadrant of the room, so that no seat at the table would fall outside the frame. He placed a microphone in the light fixture above the table, small enough that you would have to know it was there and be looking directly at it to notice. Everything transmitted to a secure server, he explained, not to a local device that could be found or confiscated or destroyed. Even if someone swept the room and located every piece of equipment and smashed it, the footage already captured would be beyond reach. He showed me the monitoring application on his phone, ran a brief test, confirmed the audio levels were clean, and was out the door in under 2 hours. After he left, I stood in the middle of the dining room and looked at it the way you look at a room you think you know and are suddenly seeing differently, all the same furniture and the same walls and the same window overlooking Eleanor's garden and something in it now that had not been there before. Elliot and Vivian came Friday morning. They worked at my dining table for most of the day, organizing the materials into a sequence that told the story clearly and in the right order. The trust documents, Eleanor's handwritten notes from the metal box, the 2 versions of Diane's deed transfer placed side by side with Elliot's written legal analysis of each fraudulent element annotated in the margins, Rex's financial report on Craig's debts, the audio recording from Nadine Fowler's office. Every piece of evidence arranged the way you arrange evidence when you want it to be understood, not just by lawyers but by anyone in the room who is paying attention. Elliot brought a projector and set it up at the far end of the dining room, positioning the screen against the wall so that it would be visible from every seat at the table. He handled the red sealed envelope, the one marked "For Walter after you have won," with a care that told me he understood what it contained, even though Eleanor had entrusted it to him without opening it in his presence. He placed it at the head of the table at Eleanor's chair, next to the small framed photograph I had carried from the kitchen windowsill. Vivian insisted on handling the food herself and would not hear any argument on the subject. Her shopping list was precise and deliberate: pot roast, roasted root vegetables, apple pie. Everything Eleanor had made for important family dinners. She said it was intentional, and when I asked her to explain, she simply said that Diane would recognize the smell when she walked in, and that everything which followed would land differently because of it. Phil Sutton called that afternoon to confirm he and Carol would arrive at 5:30, a full half hour before Diane and Craig. Phil was a retired notary public, 30 years of practice, a man whose professional function had been to witness the execution of documents and attest to the identity and apparent competence of the people signing them. His presence at my table on Saturday evening was not casual. Carol would sit beside him, warm and unremarkable and observant in the way of a woman who had spent decades attending to what happened in rooms while others assumed she was only decorating them. Friday evening, after Elliot and Vivian had gone and the house was quiet, I found myself standing in the dining room alone for a long time. The table was not yet set. The projector screen was folded against the wall. Everything was ready, and nothing had happened yet. And in that interval, I stood among 30 years of family dinners and looked at the chair where Eleanor had always sat, and thought about all the times this room had held what I had believed was the whole of my family. Vivian found me there. She did not ask what I was thinking. She put her hand on my shoulder and said, "She is here, Walter. In every piece of paper and every protection she built, and every step that brought you to this room tonight. She has been fighting for you all along." I put my hand over hers and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Saturday morning, I set the table myself. I used the good china, the set we kept for occasions that deserved it. I used the silverware Eleanor had inherited from her mother, each piece familiar in the hand in the way of things used for decades. I set 5 places. At the head of the table at Eleanor's chair, I placed the red sealed envelope beside her photograph, and I stepped back and looked at the table for a long moment. And then I went to the kitchen and began to do what had to be done before 6 o'clock came, and the headlights swept across my front window, and everything Eleanor had built came finally irrevocably into the light. They arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, which told me something about Diane's state of mind. She was not a person who arrived on time when she was relaxed. Punctuality of that particular kind, the kind that lands on the exact minute, is the punctuality of someone who has been ready for a long time and has been managing the wait. I watched from the front window as the car came to a stop at the curb, Craig stepping out first with a briefcase that was noticeably full. Diane following and pausing for a moment on the front walk to look at the house in a way I recognized even at this distance. She was assessing it. Even now, walking toward a dinner she believed was her final step toward everything she had been planning. She was looking at the structure and the roofline and the landscaping with the eyes of someone calculating what it would yield. Harper emerged from the back seat and looked up at the window where I was standing. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. She dropped her eyes and followed her parents to the door. I let them in and took their coats and said the things a grateful and slightly overwhelmed old man says when his family has agreed to come for dinner after a difficult week. The house was warm and the smell of Vivian's pot roast had been building for 3 hours, filling every room with the specific comfort of that particular dish. And I watched Diane's face as she stepped into the entryway and the smell reached her. Something crossed her expression, quick and complicated. There and gone before she could compose it away. She had grown up in a house where that smell meant Sunday, meant safety, meant Eleanor in the kitchen, and everything in its right place. Whatever she felt in that half second, she put it away efficiently and smiled at me with the smile she had been using all week. Phil and Carol Sutton were already in the living room, and the brief pause in Diane's movement when she saw them was small but visible. Phil stood and shook hands with the easy confidence of a man who has spent decades in rooms where other people were trying to manage their reactions to unexpected information. Carol smiled and said something warm about the house, which was true and required no performance. Craig looked at Diane with a question in his eyes that he did not put into words, and Diane answered it with the slight lift of one shoulder that meant continue as planned. I explained that Phil and Carol had been kind enough to check in on me regularly since Eleanor passed, and that I had invited them because I was not yet comfortable with formal occasions by myself. Diane accepted this with the graciousness she could deploy when she needed to, and Phil said he was glad to be there, and we moved toward the dining room. Elliot was seated at the corner of the table with his folder closed in front of him, and I watched the calculation happen in Diane's face the moment she identified him as something other than a dinner guest. She asked who he was with a lightness in her voice that was working very hard. I told her he was my attorney, that I had asked him to join us because I wanted to make sure I understood the documents properly before signing anything, and that I hoped she did not mind. She said, "Of course not, Dad," in the tone of someone who minds enormously and has decided this is not the moment to show it. Craig set his briefcase on the floor beside his chair with a deliberateness that was the opposite of casual. Harper sat down and looked at her plate. Vivian brought out the pot roast and served it, and we ate. The conversation moved through the careful channels that people navigate when everyone at the table knows something is coming and no one is willing to be the first to name it. Craig talked briefly about a project at work and then stopped talking about it. I asked Harper about her college applications, and she answered in complete sentences, which I appreciated. Diane commented on the neighborhood and the weather and a television program she had watched recently performing the role of a daughter at her father's table with the focus of someone for whom this role had become in recent years. Entirely a performance. I listened and nodded and refilled glasses and said that the food was wonderful, which was true. It was Craig who moved first, as I had expected it would be. He had less patience than Diane, and more immediate fear, and the combination had been pressing against the surface of the evening since he sat down. He waited until the plates were mostly clear and then reached for the briefcase and set it on the table with the click of the latches releasing. He said he thought they should get to the reason they were all there, that there were documents to review and it was getting late. And Diane put her hand briefly on his arm in a way that was not affectionate but directive. She said there was no rush and they should wait for dessert. Vivian brought in the apple pie then, and as she moved around the table serving it, Diane looked up at her for the first time, with real attention, the way you look at someone when your mind has finally connected the face in front of you to a name you know. Vivian Cross, Diane said as though saying it quietly enough might make it less true. "What are you doing here?" Vivian said. I had asked her to help with the dinner and that she had used Eleanor's recipes. And she said Eleanor's name with a gentleness that was also a weight. Diane looked at the pie and then at me, and I saw in her face the first real flicker of understanding that the evening she had planned and the evening she was in were not the same evening. She reached a decision quickly the way she always had. She looked at me and said she thought they really ought to go over the paperwork now before it got any later, and I agreed that yes, it was time. And I said that I thought everyone in the room should understand exactly where things stood. Elliot opened his folder without being asked, and the sound of the clasp releasing was very quiet, and Diane reached for her husband's briefcase, and when she looked up to hand me a pen and saw what Elliot had placed on the table in Diane, front of him, her hand stopped moving entirely. Elliot did not begin immediately. He had the temperament of a man who understood that silence deployed correctly is more effective than any opening statement, and he let the room sit with itself for a moment before he spoke. He said that before anyone signed anything, he had been asked by Walter Holt to present certain information that he believed was relevant to the evening's business. He said it in the tone of someone describing a procedural step, nothing alarming in the delivery. Everything alarming in what followed. Craig looked at Diane. Diane was looking at Elliot's folder with the expression of someone who has just noticed that the ground they are standing on has a different texture than the ground they expected. Elliot placed the first document on the table and oriented it so that everyone present could read it without straining. He explained clearly and without embellishment that Eleanor Holt had established a revocable living trust 3 years prior to her death, acting on her own legal authority and with full testamentary capacity as attested by 2 witnesses and Civ, a notary public whose records were on file. The trust had been funded with the majority of the marital assets accumulated over 4 decades, including investment accounts, retirement savings, and the proceeds from the sale of our previous home. The current value of the trust was approximately $2.4 million. I watched Diane's face as Elliot said the number. I had spent 42 years watching my daughter's face, and I knew every register it was capable of. And what I saw in that moment was something I had not seen there before. Not anger, not calculation. Something rawer and more disoriented than either of those. Elliot continued. The sole beneficiary of the trust was Walter Holt. He paused, and then said the next sentence with the particular care of a man who understands that some sentences need space around them. Diane Mercer did not appear in the trust documents in any capacity. Not as a beneficiary, not as a contingent beneficiary, not as a trustee or administrator. She had no legal claim on any portion of the trust assets, no standing to contest its terms, and no mechanism by which she could access what it contained. Diane said that was impossible. She said her mother would have told her. She said it in the voice of someone who has just discovered that a door they believed opened into a room instead opens into a wall. I looked at her and said quietly, "Would she, Diane?" and left the question where it was. Elliot produced the second document, the deed. He set it on the table and explained that Eleanor had prepared and executed a legal transfer of the residential property at my address into the name of Harper Mercer, effective upon Harper's 18th birthday or earlier if circumstances required the transfer to protect my welfare and housing security. The deed had been prepared by Elliot's office, witnessed, notarized, and held in his firm's secure files for 2 years. Harper had not known it existed until this week, when Elliot had informed her of its terms and obtained her signature of acknowledgement as required by the instrument. The house Diane had been planning to sell did not belong to me in the way she had calculated. It was already spoken for. Harper looked up from the table when Elliot said her name, and, for a moment, the 17-year-old who had been carrying this weight for weeks allowed herself to look like a girl who had just been given something extraordinary by a grandmother she still missed every day. Diane said they would contest it. She said I had clearly not been in a fit state to make legal decisions of this magnitude, and that any competent attorney could challenge the validity of documents signed under those circumstances. Elliot told her without unkindness and without hesitation that the documents had been prepared and executed 14 months before Eleanor's death, during a period in which her oncologist's records attested to full cognitive clarity, and that the legal threshold for challenging them did not exist under the applicable state statutes. He gave her a moment with that, and then he reached back into his folder. He placed Diane's 2 versions of the deed transfer side by side on the table. He placed his written analysis beside them, the one he had spent 2 evenings preparing, each fraudulent element annotated with the relevant statute and the applicable legal consequence. He explained the backdated power of attorney and noted the date of my knee surgery, which my medical records confirmed, making my execution of any document on that date a physical impossibility. He said the word felony in the same tone he had used when he said it to me alone in his office, precise and clinical and entirely serious. Craig's chair made a sound against the floor. His hands were flat on the table and he was staring at the two documents the way a man stares at something he cannot make go away by staring at it. Elliot then set Rex's financial report in front of Craig and said nothing, letting him read his own circumstances back to himself in printed summary. Craig looked at it for approximately 4 seconds and then pushed it away with the back of his hand, a gesture that was not quite composure and not quite rage, but somewhere in the narrow and diminishing space between them. Phil Sutton, who had not spoken since dinner, said from his corner of the table in the flat and authoritative voice of a man who had spent 30 years officiating documents that he thought Craig should read the full report carefully. Diane looked across the table at me then, and she abandoned the documents and the calculations and everything else she had brought into the room, and she tried the last available instrument, which was the oldest one. Her voice dropped and she said that everything they had done had been for me, that they had been frightened for me, that I was alone and aging, and they had only wanted to help. She was looking at me, the way a daughter looks at a father when she needs him to believe her. And for a moment, for just a fraction of a moment, some old reflex stirred in me in response to it. Then I thought about Eleanor's notes, each one dated, each one precise, and I looked at my daughter and said very gently, "Diane, I have the recordings." And I watched the last door close behind her eyes. Elliot reached into his folder one final time and produced a small digital recorder, the kind that fits in a shirt pocket, and set it on the table between the documents without explanation. He pressed play. The sound that came out of it was clear and immediate, the acoustics of a professional office, and Diane's voice filled my dining room with the same confident efficiency it had carried on Thursday afternoon when she had no reason to believe anyone was listening. I watched her face as she heard herself. I watched the precise moment she recognized what she was hearing and understood how it had been captured and calculated what it meant that it was being played in this room, at this table, in front of these people. The color left her face in the way color leaves a room when the sun goes behind clouds gradually and then all at once. The recording ran for 4 minutes. Diane's voice discussing market conditions and listing timelines and the mechanics of a property transfer she had described to Nadine Fowler as essentially complete. The phrase "transfer paperwork clears" delivered with the ease of someone describing something already accomplished. The specific mention of having the listing active before the end of January. Elliot stopped the playback before it reached the portion where Nadine had asked to meet with me directly because the portion he had played was already more than sufficient, and he understood, as I did, that there is a point beyond which additional evidence becomes indulgence rather than argument. He closed the recorder and set it aside. Phil Sutton stood up. He did it quietly and without drama, simply rising from his chair with the deliberateness of a large man who has decided something. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his retired notary commission card, which he set on the table in front of him. He said he had been present throughout the evening and had heard and observed everything that had occurred since his arrival, and that he was prepared to provide a sworn statement to that effect to any authority that requested one. He said it in the measured tone of professional testimony, every word placed carefully, and then he sat back down. The room received it in silence. Craig broke first. I had expected this because I had watched him across dinner tables and holiday gatherings for 9 years, and I understood the architecture of the man, which was that he was built for confidence in the absence of consequence, and had very little underneath that when consequence arrived. He pushed back from the table and stood and addressed Diane rather than any of the rest of us, which told me that in the geography of his panic the room had contracted to the two of them. He said he had told her the Christmas evening was too aggressive. He said he had told her they needed to be slower and more careful, and that she had overruled him at every step. He said he was not going to face a felony charge for a plan he had not originated. His voice was not quite shouting, but it had lost every social calibration that usually governed it. Diane told him to stop talking in a voice that was quiet and precise and completely without effect. He did not stop talking. She told him again. He sat down finally, but it was not composure, it was exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a man who has just heard the sound of something structural giving way. Elliot let the silence settle and then presented the options with the directness I had come to expect from him. The evidence currently in hand had been provided to the district attorney's office. Full voluntary cooperation with the investigation, including truthful disclosure of all relevant details and agreement to terms to be specified, would be taken into account in charging decisions and could result in a negotiated resolution, rather than full prosecution. The alternative was to allow the process to proceed without cooperation, in which case the evidence as it stood supported charges that carried significant sentencing exposure for both parties. He said it without editorializing the way you present an engineering assessment of a compromise structure. Here is what exists. Here is what it means. Here are the available paths forward and their respective consequences. Diane looked at me across the table for the first time that evening without any of the instruments she had been using all week. No warmth, no performance, no calculation visible on the surface. Just her face, as it actually was, and the exhaustion in it, and something underneath the exhaustion that I recognized from her childhood as the expression she made when she had run out of options and knew it. Craig said to no one in particular and to the table and to the room that he would cooperate, that he would provide whatever documentation was required and make whatever statements were requested. Diane did not object. I understood from her silence that she had reached the same conclusion by a different and more private route. I spoke then for the first time since the recordings had played. I told them there were terms that were mine specifically and not negotiable through any legal process. The $60,000 I had contributed to the down payment on their home 7 years ago, which had been given in love and without formal documentation, would be repaid on a monthly schedule to be determined with Elliot's assistance. They would both engage with a certified financial counselor of Elliot's recommendation, and no contact with Harper beyond what Harper herself initiated until Harper decided she was ready. Craig nodded without looking up. Diane said nothing, but she did not disagree. Harper had been silent since the recordings played, sitting in her chair with her hands folded on the table, taking up very little space in the way she sometimes did when she was absorbing something large. She looked at Diane now steadily and without anger, and said simply that she was going to be all right, and that she wanted her mother to know that. It was not forgiveness. It was not an opening. It was a 17-year-old girl refusing to disappear from the room just because the adults in it had made it easier for her to do so. Diane looked at her daughter for a long moment, and then she lowered her head, and Carol Sutton reached across and put her hand over Diane's without a word. The room held that. Then Diane lifted her face and looked past everyone at the red sealed envelope sitting at Eleanor's place at the head of the table beside the photograph. And her voice when she spoke was barely a voice at all. "Did she leave anything?" Diane said. "Did Mom leave any message for me?" The question hung in the room the way certain questions do, the ones that reveal more about the person asking them than any answer could. Diane's voice had shed everything that had been layered over it all evening, all the performance and the management and the controlled efficiency, and what remained was something I had not heard from her in a very long time. It was the voice she had as a child when she was frightened and did not want to be seen as frightened, and hearing it now, at this table, after everything that had preceded it, was among the most complicated experiences of my life. I looked at her for a moment. Then I stood and picked up the red sealed envelope from Eleanor's chair. I told them there was one more thing. I said that Eleanor had left a message recorded 3 years ago, and that she had made me promise it would only be seen after the truth had come into the open, after the choices Diane had made had been named and faced. I said it simply and without drama because the moment did not need any addition from me. It had its own weight. Carol Sutton guided Diane and Craig gently back to their chairs. Phil remained where he was. Harper did not move at all. Elliot positioned his laptop at the end of the table and angled the screen so that every seat had a clear view, and I handed him the envelope. He broke the wax seal and removed the USB drive and inserted it without a word, and we waited in the particular silence of people who are about to hear something they cannot unhear. The screen filled with the image of Eleanor in her home office, the one with the window behind her that looked out over the garden she had spent 20 years cultivating. She was visibly ill. The illness had taken weight from her and replaced it with a kind of translucence, and her head was wrapped in the soft gray scarf she had worn every day in her final months. But her eyes were the eyes I had fallen in love with in 1974, fully present, entirely focused, and when she began to speak, her voice was steady in the way of someone who has decided exactly what they want to say, and has said it enough times in their own mind that the words come out clean and unfaltering. The time stamp in the lower corner of the frame showed a date 3 days before she died. Diane, she said, and the sound of Eleanor's voice in that room after 2 years of its absence was a physical thing that moved through me from the outside in. If you are watching this, it means everything I was afraid of has come true. It means you chose what you chose, and it breaks my heart in ways I do not have words for. She folded her hands in her lap, composed her eyes already red, but her voice not breaking. She said she was recording this because she needed Diane to understand that she had known. She had heard Diane on the telephone discussing the house as though it were already transferred. She had seen the way Diane moved through her parents' home during visits in those final months, not as a daughter returning to a beloved place, but as someone conducting an inventory of what they expected to inherit. She said that when she had told Diane her cancer had spread beyond treatment, Diane's first question had not been about pain management or time or what Eleanor needed in the days remaining. She said Diane remembered what that first question had been. She said she did too. "I set up tests," Eleanor continued. "I gave you opportunities to prove that what I was seeing was my own fear distorting what was real. I recorded conversations. I documented dates and words and the things that were not said alongside the things that were. I wanted to be wrong," she said, and her voice carried the full weight of that wanting. "I wanted so badly to be wrong about you. You failed every test I set, Diane. Every single one, and I had to stop pretending otherwise." Eleanor leaned slightly forward, and her expression shifted into something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but contained the essential element of both, which is love that has been wounded past the point of easy recovery. She said she wanted Diane to remember something. She said when Diane was 7 years old, she had fallen from her bicycle and fractured her wrist, and she had been so frightened in the emergency room that she would not release Eleanor's hand even when the doctors needed access to the injury, and she had made both her parents promise they would never leave her. Eleanor said she had kept that promise. She had kept it through every visit that was actually an audit, through every conversation that circled back to assets and accounts, through every moment of her dying in which she had chosen to protect a man who deserved protecting rather than confront a daughter who had already chosen her path. "I love your father more than I love my own pain," Eleanor said, "and I will not let you take from him what we built together." She sat back. Her hands had begun to tremble slightly, and she folded them again, stilling them with the discipline I had watched her apply to every difficulty in 4 decades of shared life. She looked directly at the camera in a way that made it feel, even now, even in a recording made 3 years ago, in a room she would never sit in again, as though she were looking at each person watching. "I hope someday you understand what you actually lost," she said. "Not the money. The love. The family. The father who would have given you anything you asked for if you had only asked. Goodbye, Diane." The screen went dark. No one spoke. The silence in the room was the kind that forms after something irreversible has occurred, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who understand that whatever comes next will have to come from a different place than language. Then Diane went slowly to her knees beside her chair, not dramatically, not in performance, but in the way of someone whose body has simply registered a weight it cannot stand upright under, and she wept in a way I had not seen from her since she was a child. Craig moved toward her, and she did not push him away this time. Through her tears, she looked up at me, and her voice, when she finally found it, was barely audible across the table. "Did she leave anything else?" Diane said. "Any other message? Anything at all?" I looked at the second red envelope still sitting at Eleanor's place, the one I had not opened, the one marked in Eleanor's handwriting, "For Walter after you have won," and I understood that what happened in the next moment was mine alone to decide. I held the second envelope in my hands and looked at my daughter on the floor beside her chair, and I made the decision that I believe Eleanor had known I would make, because she had known me for 41 years, and she had prepared for this moment with the same precision she had brought to back everything else. Eleanor had left no second message for Diane. The envelope marked, "For Walter after you have won," was not for our daughter at all. It had never been for our daughter. I understood that clearly, and I understood something else alongside it, which was that telling Diane the truth about the envelope's contents would not give her anything she needed and would take from me something I was not willing to share in this room, on this evening. I looked at her and I said quietly and without anger, no. She didn't leave anything else. Diane's face crumpled completely at that, the last structure giving way. And I let the truth of it stand where it was, because sometimes the most honest thing you can offer a person is the space to feel what they have actually earned. Carol Sutton moved to Diane with the unhurried practicality of a woman who has comforted people through difficult things many times before and knows that the most useful thing in such moments is not words but presence and gentle direction. She helped Diane to her feet and spoke to her in a low voice and guided her toward the door. Phil assisted Craig, who had the look of a man walking out of a building that has just been condemned, understanding what it means without yet being able to calculate what comes next. At the threshold, Phil turned back and looked at me across the length of the dining room, and he nodded once, a single deliberate movement that carried in it 30 years of neighborly respect, and something more specific than that, the acknowledgement of one man who has witnessed something significant to another man who has survived it. Then they were gone, and the front door closed, and the house settled into a silence that felt different from any silence it had held before. Cleaner somehow. More honest. Vivian began collecting plates without being asked, her way of giving me room to breathe without leaving me alone in the room. Elliot closed his laptop with the careful reverence of someone handling something that has just performed a serious and necessary function. Harper had not moved from her chair, and when I sat back down, she looked at me with Eleanor's eyes in a younger face and asked softly if she could see it. She gestured toward the envelope still in my hands. I nodded and broke the seal, and my hands were not steady as I unfolded the 2 pages inside, both covered in Eleanor's handwriting on the stationery she had used for important correspondence for as long as I could remember. Cream-colored and slightly textured, the kind that holds ink the way good paper should. I read it aloud. My voice broke in the first sentence and broke again in the third, and I kept going anyway because Eleanor had written it to be read, and I intended to honor that. "My dearest Walter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, you have won. You have protected yourself and everything we built together. And knowing you the way I know you, you are probably sitting in that dining room feeling sad that it had to come to this. So, I am writing to tell you something important. Don't. You did nothing wrong. You loved completely and gave generously and raised a daughter with every advantage we could offer. What she chose to do with that love and that generosity is on her, not on you. I want you to sit with that until you believe it, because it is true and because you have spent enough of your life carrying weight that was never yours to carry." I had to stop then. I pressed the back of my hand against my eyes, and Vivian left the dishes and came and sat beside me, and Harper reached across the table and took my other hand and held it, and after a moment, I kept reading. Eleanor wrote that she had been thinking about all the things we had postponed. The trips set aside for retirement, the adventures deferred in favor of responsibility, the experiences we had looked at and said someday, as though someday were a place we were definitely going to reach. She said I had resources now and time and no more reasons for postponing, and she had made me a list. The second page was covered in her handwriting from top to bottom, titled in her precise capitals, 50 Things I Wish We Had Done Together. I read through it with tears making the lines swim and come back into focus. Visit the Grand Canyon. Take a cooking class. Learn to dance properly, not just swaying in the kitchen the way you always insisted counted. Write your memoir. Go to that jazz club in New Orleans we talked about every winter for 20 years and never went to. Plant a garden. Learn Italian. The list went on, practical and extravagant, and entirely Eleanor, full of the life she had believed was still worth living even as she was leaving it. The letter concluded in her voice at its most direct, the way she spoke when she wanted to be certain she was heard. Use some of the trust to do these things, Walter. But also use some of it to help others. Students who cannot afford the education they deserve. Families crushed by medical debt. People who need someone to believe in them before they can believe in themselves. Build something that outlasts us both and makes what we worked for mean something beyond the two of us. And, Walter, she wrote, and these were the last words on the page, live. Please live. Live for both of us now. I set the letter down, and I was crying, and I was also for the first time in 2 years smiling, and both of those things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out. Harper squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, and I was grateful for the hurt. Vivian put her arm around my shoulders. Elliot, who had been quiet through all of it, spoke then in the careful voice he used when he was saying something he wanted to get exactly right. He told me that Eleanor had included in her written instructions to him a request that if I was willing, he would like to help me establish a scholarship fund. He said she had already chosen the name. The Eleanor Holt Memorial Engineering Scholarship, designed to support students from low-income families who could not afford the lab fees and equipment costs that stood between them and the education they had earned. He said it was exactly what she would have wanted, and he said it in the tone of a man who had known her long enough to mean it. I looked at the list in my hands, 50 things Eleanor had wanted us to do together. And outside the window, the winter dark was complete, and the house was warm, and the people in it were the people who had chosen to be there. For the first time since the night Eleanor died, I felt the future as something other than a corridor I was walking through alone. It felt like somewhere I was actually going. The 6 months that followed moved the way recovery moves, not in a straight line and not at any predictable pace, but forward, always incrementally forward, which I came to understand was enough. Diane received a negotiated resolution from the district attorney's office, 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a formal record that would follow her in ways neither of us could fully anticipate. Craig made his first monthly payment toward the $60,000 in early February, a bank transfer that arrived without a note attached, which I thought was probably the most honest communication he had sent me in 9 years. I did not hear from either of them directly for a long time, and I found to my own surprise that the silence was not painful. It was simply accurate. It reflected the actual distance between us, which had always been there, and which I had spent years furnishing and decorating to make it look like something it was not. In March, a letter arrived in Diane's handwriting, forwarded through Elliot's office. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for 2 days before I opened it. The handwriting inside was uncertain in a way her handwriting had never been, each line slightly uneven, as though the words had been difficult to move from wherever she had found them to the page. She wrote that she did not expect forgiveness and understood she had not earned it. She wrote that she was trying. In the community service hours and in the conversations she had begun having with a therapist, to understand how she had become the person who had sat at my dining room table with a briefcase full of fraudulent documents and called it concern. She wrote that the people supervising her community service hours had been kinder to her than she deserved. She wrote that she had been learning about her mother, reading the notes Eleanor had kept, and that she was learning a great many things she should have cared about years ago. I read the letter twice and put it in the drawer of my desk. I did not reply. I was not ready, and I had decided sometime in those 6 months that not being ready was a complete and sufficient answer to certain questions, and that I would know when it changed. Elliot and I established the Eleanor Holt Memorial Engineering Scholarship in April, working through the legal and administrative structure over 3 weeks of careful documentation that I found genuinely pleasurable in the way I had always found precise work pleasurable. The first recipient was selected in May, a young woman named Maria from a town 40 miles south of mine, the first in her family to pursue an engineering degree. Held back not by ability but by the cost of the laboratory equipment her program required. When Elliot read me her application essay over the phone, I had to ask him to stop twice so I could compose myself. She reminded me of students I had mentored in my working years, the ones who had everything required except the resources to exercise it. Helping her felt like the most natural extension of everything Eleanor had intended. And I understood then what my wife had meant when she wrote that making our money mean something was not a secondary goal, but the primary one. I visited the Grand Canyon in June with Vivian driving rather than flying, because Eleanor's list had specified the drive, and we stood at the south rim at sunset and watched the light move across the rock in colors I had no adequate language for. Vivian did not try to describe it either. We stood there for a long time without speaking, which was its own form of conversation. I started a memoir in July, writing in the mornings at the kitchen table before the day became complicated, setting down the details of a life in engineering and marriage and parenthood that I had never thought anyone would want to read, and finding as I wrote that the act of recording it was sufficient reason in itself. I took a cooking class in the fall and learned 3 dishes I could make without consulting a recipe card, which Eleanor would have found remarkable and said so. On a bright morning in early October, my phone buzzed with a message from Harper asking if I could meet her at Rosewood Coffee at 2 in the afternoon. I arrived before she did and was sitting with my coffee when she came through the door, moving with the particular energy of someone carrying news they have been waiting to deliver. She sat down across from me and pushed an envelope across the table before she had even taken off her coat. Inside was an acceptance letter from the pre-law program at State University beginning the following fall. She told me with the directness she had inherited from her grandmother that watching everything that had happened over the past year had clarified something for her that she had not previously been able to name. She wanted to use the law the way Elliot had used it. She wanted to protect people who could not protect themselves. I did not trust my voice for a moment, so I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, and she understood. That evening I made pot roast from Eleanor's recipe card, the one spotted with 40 years of kitchen use and the house filled with the smell of it. Vivian arrived first, bringing bread she had made herself. Elliot came next, with the scholarship documents for our review. Harper set the table for 4 and left one place empty with Eleanor's photograph beside it, and nobody suggested moving it because nobody wanted to. When we sat down, I raised my glass and said to Eleanor, who taught me that love is not only what you give but what you refuse to let be taken, and to family not the one you are born into but the one that chooses you and the one you choose in return. To Eleanor they said, outside the window impossibly and perfectly snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, soft and unhurried, covering everything in the yard that Eleanor had planted and tended and left for me to tend after her. I watched it through the glass and felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt in 2 years, something I had been afraid I might not feel again. It was peace. It was quiet and uncomplicated and entirely real, and I sat with it the way you sit with something you have waited a long time to receive, carefully, gratefully, without looking away. If you have ever been dismissed by someone who should have loved you better, trust what you know. Document what you see. Find the people who will stand beside you when standing costs something. And remember that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. It is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. Eleanor knew that. In the end, so did I. What Walter's story teaches us is something I think about every time I hear from someone who has been quietly dismissed by the very people who were supposed to love them most. The lesson is not about revenge, even though justice was served beautifully in the end. The lesson is about preparation, about paying attention, and about refusing to mistake silence for safety. Eleanor understood something that most of us learn too late. Love without documentation is vulnerable, and trust without verification is not wisdom, it is wishfulness. She did not wait for things to go wrong before she acted. She saw clearly, she planned carefully, and she built a fortress around the man she loved while she still had time to do it. That is extraordinary. What Walter did was equally important. He did not collapse under humiliation. He did not confront in anger. He gathered, he documented, he found people he could trust. And he waited until the truth could speak for itself without anyone being able to argue against it. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. If something feels wrong in your family, trust that feeling. Write things down. Keep records. Find one person outside the situation whose judgment you trust completely and tell them what you are seeing. Do not sign anything under pressure. Do not let urgency be used as a weapon against your own careful thinking. And please, do not confuse someone's need for your assets with love for you as a person. Those are very different things, and Walter's story shows us exactly what it looks like when we finally learn to tell them apart. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.